Chapter 20. No Rose Without Thorns. Philip awoke alone, the dungeon ceiling crumbling above him and the broken stone bench stabbing into his back. By the barely there crease of his sleeve across his arm, he figured he hadn't been asleep long. The ghost of Briar Rose's touch still lingered on his hand, and he rubbed his fingers together. If Maleficent wanted Philip alive for 100 years, someone would have to visit again. He could figure out how to escape, and Briar Rose was right. They could get out of this if they tried. But why did she have to ask him to kiss her? She had a true love who was probably disgustingly chivalrous and shiny, and Philip couldn't entertain the idea that it could be him. He knew better than to expect things in Briar Rose's meeting her true love right after he realized he liked her was just the sort of disappointment the world enjoyed throwing at him. There was so much going on, and for both of them, that there wasn't time to deal with the fallout that would cause. Better to assume it wasn't him. It wasn't him. If he thought that often enough, then when it wasn't, he wouldn't be upset. Hopefully. Except Briar Rose knew she had a true love. She knew there was someone out there who would perfectly complement her, and she didn't seem eager for Philip to find that person. She had told Philip to kiss her first. She didn't think Philip could wake her, did she? Philip rolled into a seated position and tugged at his hair. Her request could only mean that she liked him well enough to choose him over her true love, or believe that he could be that true love, and the thought made him feel as if every rib in his chest were curling around his heart. He wanted to be that person. He wasn't sure he could be, but none of it mattered if he couldn't get out of there. His shackles had no lock, but the walls were crumbling. He could use that, and the 3 fairy godmothers were still out there. Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, I don't know if you can hear me, he whispered in case Briar Rose was listening to him from the dream world, but shh, said someone outside his door. Philip stilled. That wasn't Maleficent. But how are we going to help? Asked someone else. The shush shushed again, and a third person sighed. Can't you feel it? The third person asked. The sword of truth and the shield of virtue are nearby, and while I don't know why, I'm not looking this particular gift in the mouth. Horse, dear. What horse? Philip knew those voices. He had grown up hearing them in dreams. Laughing, he dropped his face into his hands. How often had he heard Briar Rose's aunts bickering over her? 3 small specks like glints of light drifted through the barred window in the door. Magic preceded them, scenting the air with apples and reminding him of spring. He lifted his head as they enlarged their fairy forms, and the 3 of them got to work immediately. Each wore a different color, though it looked as if the Forbidden Mountain had zapped the sheen from them. The tallest took his bounds wrist in hand. Shh, she said. No time to explain. The fairy had had more than 15 years to explain, but he let that slide. As she freed his wrists, the one in green used her magic to burn through the shackles on his ankles, and the one in blue slowly destroyed the lock on the door. Their powers were flashier than Eris's, sparkling like stars in the dim cell. The chains fell away, and he stepped forward to fully free himself. He had to get to Briar Rose as quickly as possible. Wait, Prince Philip, said the one in dull red. She gestured for him to come back. The road to true love may be barred by still many more dangers, which you alone will have to face. So arm thyself with this enchanted shield of virtue. She waved her wand, and there was a tinkle of bells. The shield of virtue appeared on his arm with a flicker of magic. Philip pulled back, surprised, and then groaned. Eris had said summoning that, and the sword of truth required purely good intent, practically confessing her alliance with Maleficent. He had been too caught up in his own problems to notice. The fairy carried on without explanation, and this mighty sword of truth. The sword appeared, as sharp and ready as it had been when he last carried it, and the hilt was even warm against his hand. He tested its weight to ensure Eris hadn't done anything to it. For these weapons of righteousness will triumph over evil, she said. Before he could ask how, she said, Now come, we must hurry. The fairies ushered him out of the cell. Outside, Maleficent's raven glided around the spiral staircase, cawing angrily when it saw them. It fluttered up, and the fairies raised their wands but did nothing. It squawked and flapped its way up the northern stairs, and Philip led the fairies south. When they were halfway up the stairs, the clatter of hooves and claws against stone echoed down. A wave of Maleficent's enchanted creatures raced down the stairs to them, the raven in the lead. Philip pivoted. Down, 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 he mumbled. I don't know another way up. There was a large window, empty and looming over a broken wall, and he darted for it. The fairies twisted into their small forms that were little more than specks of light. He reached the window first. A steep drop from the mountain was the only view he could make out. The first of the creatures neared. He slashed the sword through the air. It knocked the club of a creature aside, throwing both to the floor. More tumbled over each other, spear tips and broken knives flying through the air after the fairies, and he blocked as many as he could. He couldn't even feel the weight of the shield on his arm as he raised it to take the hit of a mace. The fairies cleared the window without getting hit, and Philip leapt out. They would have told him if the drop was sheer. He landed on the falling edge of an old rampart and jumped to a nearby crumbling wall, then slipped from it and slid down a pile of shattered rocks. A horse squealed in fear, and Philip rolled to his feet in a courtyard. Samson, he breathed. A chain held Samson to a heavy rock on the other side of the courtyard. How did you get here, boy? Maleficent must have captured him, said the Green Fairy. I'm saddened that we're meeting in such dire circumstances, but it is good to meet you, Philip. I am Fauna. The others are Flora and Merryweather. She gestured to the fairies in red and blue. My friend, a knight. She escaped when Maleficent captured me and went to warn people with Samson, he said, and rounded on the fairies. Have you seen her? Can you summon her like you did the arms? Fauna wrung her hands together. Oh, dear. No, summoning people is much more difficult, and the old magic that lives in this mountain refrains us from attempting it. Fear rose his hands, and Philip took a deep breath to calm himself before heading into the courtyard. Philip, cried one of the fairies, watch out! Samson squealed again, and Philip threw up his shield arm to cover as much of himself as he could. Rocks plummeted from the wall above, and the magic shot toward them. With the toll of a small bell, the rocks became bubbles and bursts. Philip lowered his shield. He sprinted toward Samson. He had to figure out what had happened to Joanna and make sure she was all right. If she had come after him or gotten captured, that meant his father might not yet know what was going on. More help might not be on its way. Bowstrings snapped in unison, thrumming in Philip's ears, and he spun with the shield raised. Flora glowed a soft pink and slashed her wand through the air. The arrows sprouted and bloomed. Flowers fell limp against the shield. Maybe save your magic for Maleficent, he murmured. He felt so conflicted. They were helping, but if this was what they were capable of, why hadn't they trained Briar Rose or him or anyone to fight for themselves? Why all the subterfuge? It was infuriating and confusing. Those kinds of arrows wouldn't have pierced the shield. Flora bristled. A scream rang out over the courtyard. Joanna's voice in the clash of steel against stone reached him, and Philip darted to where it was coming from. In a small ruined garden over a wall of the courtyard, Joanna, with her sword drawn and a trail of downed goons in her wake, had her gaze fixed on Eris, Frike, and Poana. The fairies on the other side of the garden looked furious, with smoke pouring from Poana's sneer, and the wind whipping violently around Eris. Joanna must have fought her way into the Forbidden Mountain. Philip whistled. Not everything going to plan? He shouted and raised the sword of truth. Frike screeched, You little! Joanna used the distraction to charge, She split the trio, separating Frike from the others. Frike threw herself back, the tip of Joanna's blade tearing across her side, and vanished in a ripple of shadows. She re-emerged against the wall and grasped at the gash in her arm. Eris laughed, but Poanna raised her hand. A ribbon of white-hot fire unfurled from her wand, twisted around Joanna's sword, and melted through the blade. Joanna yelped, and Philip started to jump over the wall to join her. Flora held him back. "We need to go," she said. "Now." "I'm not leaving Joanna to deal with them on her own," said Philip. It was impossible for Joanna to take on all three of the fairies, no matter how skilled she was. Joanna might have known how they fought, but they were still powerful magical beings with decades of practice. Philip had nearly killed her on accident without even trying. He'd had to... "You can't kill her!" Philip laughed and leaned out over the garden. "None of you can hurt her. Curses, gifts, and deals. You can't break a promise, remember? You cannot harm Joanna." Eris's smile fell, and she rolled her eyes to stare at him. "Destroy her weapons all you want, but you cannot hurt her," he said. Eris raised a hand to him. "What about you?" A frigid wind struck his back, and Philip would have tumbled headfirst into the garden had the three good fairies not grabbed him. They were far stronger than he would have guessed. With an insulted huff, Merryweather darted in front of Philip and jabbed her wand toward Eris. What looked like a soap bubble grew and grew and grew until it completely covered the whole garden in a shimmering dome. Eris scowled and gestured with her wand. The bubble stretched toward Philip, but didn't pop. He didn't even feel the chill of her magic. Eris threw up her arms, but whatever she yelled was trapped in the bubble with her. "We can't leave Joanna in there," Philip said, trying not to sound ungrateful. "If they truly promise not to hurt her, she'll be right as rain," said Flora, frowning down at Eris. "But we really must go now." In the bubble, Joanna waved a hand at him and faced the fairies. She opened her arms wide to the fairies and said something Philip couldn't hear. Eris threw another burst of magic at the bubble and hollered when it didn't break. Philip turned away. "All right," he said. "I guess it's more like they're trapped in there with Joanna." "How do you know Eris?" Flora asked as Merryweather muttered. "I should have known she would stick her nose into this." Philip sprinted to Samson to avoid answering. Merryweather freed Samson of his chains, and Philip swung himself astride. The fairies flew with them right above his shoulders. "Whatever you do, don't stop," Philip said to Samson, taking the reins in his shield hand. "Just get us out of here." The enchanted creatures huddled atop the door of the castle, and the raven called from the ramparts. Slowly the creatures overturned great cauldrons of hot oil. Flora shielded them with a rainbow that made the oil slide uselessly to their sides and fizzled on the ground. The gate of the castle grew nearer and nearer, and the portcullis began to fall. Philip urged Samson to go faster, and the grating crashed to the ground the moment they cleared it. Outside, the drawbridge began to rise, and the fairies swept over the edge. Philip gripped the reins tightly. "Watch out, Philip!" Fauna said. Samson leapt, magic help keeping them aloft for a moment, and landed hard on the opposite side. The rock crumbled under his hooves, and he pulled himself onto solid ground. They raced down the mountainside, with bright light chasing them. Philip glanced back. Maleficent had climbed to the tallest of her towers. "Hurry," said Flora. "Hurry, Philip." Clouds of green swirled in the sky above Maleficent, and she lifted her staff. Thunder crashed and lightning struck the arch of stone above the mountain path. The rocks shattered and fell. Philip knocked the debris away with the shield. Lightning tore through the rock path before them. They fell down the side of the mountain. Samson jumped from one ledge to another, scrambling for a hold. Philip's bones ached with the landing. Samson cleared the final chasm with a wild neigh. Philip took a deep breath as they left the jagged land of the Forbidden Mountain, and King Stephan's castle came into view on the horizon. They had escaped, for now. Storm clouds, dark as night, reached out across the sky and encircled the white towers. They gathered in a deepening fog, casting the whole countryside in shadow. Lightning split the world. Philip risked another look back, and Maleficent, a laughing horned shade against the green sky, stood at the center of the clouds. Samson whimpered. Philip pulled up on the reins, turning around. An endless forest of thorns as long as Philip's legs sprouted through the ground, cracking the earth like an egg. They writhed and twisted, and a great tangle of them covered the road. Samson stopped just in time, rearing away from the pike-like thorns. Philip urged him on slowly. "Like the thorn wall in the dreams," said Philip, cutting through a thorny vine and ignoring the dread in his gut. "But somehow worse." Philip tore through the thorns with his sword. He would not be stopped by them, not ever again. "Why did you think Maleficent's curse wouldn't happen?" he asked the fairies, hacking at the thorns. "Curses always come to pass." The fairies flitted above him, and Flora sniffed. "Maleficent's power was greatly reduced after she was banished," she said. "Given that Merryweather's gift altered the curse, and we would be assisting, we were hopeful that it wasn't set in stone. While it's true that curses always come true, like our gifts, the details of how they come true can be manipulated to be more beneficial," Fauna added. She hovered over Philip's shoulder. "We were not aware you studied curses and fairy magic, Your Highness." "I didn't," he said, as Samson continued to charge ahead. Philip slashed the thorns out of their way with his sword, and he and Samson bound over an outcropping toward the stone road. The thorns had grown the thickest there, trying to block access to the castle completely. It was exactly like the thorns from the dream, which had grown through everything in their path. Philip urged Samson onto the bridge over the river and glanced at the fairies. "Where is everyone? Are they safe?" "Asleep, to be awakened when Princess Aurora wakes," said Flora. "They are perfectly safe." "Asleep?" asked Philip, incredulous. "How is that safe? They're about to be in the middle of a battlefield. They can't get to safety if they're asleep, and now we need to worry about protecting them and keeping the fight contained." "It will all work itself out," Flora said, and tensed at the sight of the thorns twisting up through the road ahead of them. Philip snapped his head to her. "Will it? Briar Rose won't thank you for placing her life above everyone else's." "Well," she paused. "What do you mean, Briar Rose?" "No!" Maleficent's scream echoed across the land, cutting off his answer, and the sky grew painfully bright. "It cannot be!" A twisting knot of purple and gold magic tore overhead, slammed into the stone bridge before Philip, and splashed across the stones like liquid fire. Samson reared, and Philip struggled to comfort him. Maleficent must have discovered that he had stolen the sword and shield. She appeared, wreathed in green flames and black smoke. "Now shall you deal with me, O Prince," she said, raising her staff, "and all the powers of hell!" Philip held tight to Samson. The fire burned brighter and more violently, and smoke covered the bridge. Maleficent's form twisted, bones and magic crackling like a fire, and the ghastly burn of brimstone filled Philip's nose. She stretched all the way to the clouds circling above, and from the clouds emerged the toothy maw of a great dragon. Her terrible wings unfurled across the sky and blocked out what little sun was left. Green flames spilled from her cackling mouth. Fear froze Philip. He couldn't do this. He wasn't a hero. He was the one who had gotten them into this mess in the first place. This was a display of power so awesome the mere sight of it nearly stopped his heart. How could he defeat her? He wasn't. Her tail flicked, knocking against the castle tower, and the stones wobbled as they might fall. The image of Briar Rose, cursed in his sleep, came to him, and Philip shuddered. She had been cut off from the world for so long, and she would be stuck sleeping in that tower forever if he didn't win. He couldn't let that happen. He would do anything to ensure she got to see the world. Philip urged Samson on despite the terror trembling through him and the rattle of Maleficent's footfalls in his bones, and he peered up at the tower through the thorns. "Why don't you kiss me?" Briar Rose's question played in his head over and over again. Maybe she thought he was her true love because this feeling, the heady mix of joy and terror and unyielding drive to keep going until she was free to live the life she'd always wanted, could only be love. Philip loved her. He loved her, and he had to do this. No one else could. If Briar Rose, who knew him better than anyone, loved him enough to think he could be her true love, then he wasn't as cowardly or as bad as he thought. She believed in him, and for once, he believed in himself too. "Just you and me, boy," he muttered to Samson, and pressed the horse to run. "We can do this." Samson took off, galloping across the stones toward Maleficent's feet, and she reared back, smoke spilling from her nostrils. Philip raised the shield to block her spout of flames, and the force of them knocked him from Samson. He landed hard on his back, the heat of her power scorching his clothes. His shield arm, though, was fine. It wasn't even warm. Philip leapt to his feet, and Maleficent spat more flames across the bridge, forcing him away from her. The stones melted beneath his feet. He had to get her underbelly, where the interlocking black scales faded to an almost translucent purple. All creatures had a heart, and all hearts could break. He only had to find hers. He rose, his eyes locked with the dragon's, and stood at the edge of the crumbling bridge. She buffeted him with fire again, forcing him back. The shield stayed cold and steady on his arm. Samson squealed behind him. The thorns were at Philip's back, and he dove into them. His years in the dream wood had broken his fear of them. A prick from a thorn or a spindle was nothing in the face of what needed to be done. Philip waited behind a thick vine. Maleficent tucked her face into the thorns, fire burning any that got too near her. She stretched out her neck more, her jaw right above the ground, and Philip lunged, bringing the sword of truth down atop her snout. Her face slammed into the dirt. The scales beneath the blade bent but didn't break. She snatched her face away from him. Philip thrusted for her eyes, and she twisted, snapping at him. Her fangs ripped through the air where he had been, and he swung for her eyes again. She reared up onto her hind legs and out of his reach. Philip darted back into the thorns, fear racing in his chest. Maleficent burned through them, spewing flames across the land. The thorns went up in an acrid black smoke that choked his lungs. Philip cut and shoved his way through the thorns. He skidded into a steep cliff, the stone rising high up before him, and the flames creeping closer behind. "Up!" cried one of the fairies. "Up this way!" Gripping the sword with his shield hand, he began to climb with his other. Maleficent's footsteps thundered behind him, and the forest of thorns shattered beneath her form. The scorching heat of her drew nearer and nearer. "The fire's spreading," he shouted at Flora, struggling to scale the cliff. "Will people wake up if they're in danger?" The fairy twisted her hands together and didn't answer. Philip groaned, climbing as quickly as he could. He had to finish this now. He yanked himself to the top of the cliff, and the shield jerked his arm around. Maleficent's teeth clanked together where his arm had been. He struck out with the sword. It whistled through the air and grazed her jaw. She snapped at him again. He dodged and swung. The fire burned higher beneath them. Maleficent climbed up the cliff, curling her body over the rocks and forcing him back yet again. The sword was barely longer than her teeth, and he couldn't land a hit. Her scales weren't even scratched. The familiar grip of futility took him, and he barely jumped out of the way of her jaws. The cliff edge crumbled under his foot. He swung his arms for balance, throwing the suddenly heavy shield forward. It righted him but slipped down his arm. Maleficent spat another bout of flames at him. The shield took the brunt of them, but the force of magic toppled Philip and ripped the shield from his arm. It tumbled over the cliff and down into the inferno. Maleficent's laughter cut through Philip like a knife. He swallowed and raised the sword. If he couldn't beat her, maybe he could distract her long enough for the fairies to get everyone else to safety. He opened his mouth to shout, and a bright, warm magic washed over him. The 3 good fairies flitted down to him and hovered over his shoulder. "Now, Sword of Truth, fly swift and sure," said Flora, "that evil die and good endure." Fly? They wanted him to throw his only weapon? Philip tightened his grip on the sword. Swords weren't made to be thrown, magic or not. And what did the fairies know about fighting? He could wait. He could lure Maleficent forward and wait for the cliff to crumble. He could hit her heart then. But Briar's Rose voice echoed in his head. "Trust them," she had said. Maleficent lunged for Maleficent. He took a breath, adjusting his grip, and flung the last weapon he had at Maleficent's monstrous form.